Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ground Truth, and today we're going to be talking about organ harvesting in China. And with us to talk about that subject, maybe the most qualified guy on the planet to discuss it, Ethan Gutman, who is amongst, I give you portions of his bio because we could spend the whole program just talking about his qualifications. A visiting fellow for China Research, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, co-founder of the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, amongst other things, a Nobel Peace Prize nominee in 2017, the author of all kinds of things, but most notably for our purposes here, a book called The Slaughter on this very issue. And Ethan has probably, I have no idea how many publications, top drawer publications in the world he has written for, and folks he has consulted for. So, Ethan, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, look, let's start with this. What you and I are going to do, what we've talked about prior to this, is three-part examination of this issue of organ harvesting, human organ harvesting in China. Um, and we're going to focus on a particular sort of chronological period for today. But up front, just, for the average guy or gal out there who maybe is actually hearing about this entire issue for the first time listening to this, what are we talking about? What does that mean, organ harvesting in China?
Well, we're all aware you can get a new, if an organ is failing, you can get a new organ transplanted as long as you can tissue match it. That is, if you can somehow get an organ which your body won't reject. And there are certainly ways to do that, to put that together. So basically, China is the number one center for that in the world today, bigger than America. That's somewhat controversial, but it's actually true. And that doesn't mean that they can send organs, by Domino's pizza delivery. You have to go to China to go to a hospital, and you have to have the operation there and so forth. This is obviously an expensive process. We can get into the funding as we go along, but that is the basic nature of it. And there are a lot of people, it is a medical miracle. People who have a bad kidney or a bad liver, and stuck in a hospital bed will see themselves miraculously rise from that bed and go on to live normal lives for another 20 years. It's absolutely amazing. Amazing procedure. I personally have a cousin who got a new lung. And he's doing pretty well. Okay.
So what's the problem then? This sounds, there's an implication here though that this is not, it may be a medical miracle, but the way it's transpiring in China is not kosher.
Well, the way it's done in America is that you basically become an organ donor, which is a fairly simple process. I think it's usually done through you basically just have it put on your driver's license that say if you're in an accident or something like that, it's fatal, or you're going to die, that they can take your organs and use them. And certainly a lot of the organs in America too also come from overdoses, right? People overdosing on drugs, that kind of thing. The issue in China was from the very beginning, and this is where we sort of get into organ harvesting 1.0, as I like to call it. From the beginning, you had a problem that they did not rely on donors, voluntary donors. They relied on prisoners. So that goes way back to even the 70s in China. In fact, from the very beginning, the state is involved. It's not a private process. It's not it's a state-run capacity, okay, to remove these organs and get them into other people. Initially, it was done with prisoners who were on death row. Yeah? In one case, way back in '76, there's a kind of very theatrical, very dramatic incident where a woman who was a dissident uh, had her organs, kidneys removed publicly, and they tried to transplant them in some cadre, some beloved Maoist cadre, and they didn't take, and it didn't work. I never include that because I believe that's Maoist theater. I don't believe that was a real attempt at organ transplantation, but it shows the interest in this right from the beginning, that this could be used as a form of punishment. So the really you get down to business in the 80s, in the 1980s, and it's done with a very small amount of prisoners, and they're basically taking a kidney or two on the killing fields of China in the execution grounds. So they would shoot the prisoner. And this is a person who, whether or not we think they might be guilty, they were pronounced guilty by some sort of court. In many cases, they probably are guilty of terrible crimes. And the organs are taken out. And this was done on a fairly small scale. And it isn't until about 92 to 94 that we start running into a real problem, an ethical problem, if you like. I mean, you can argue about this business about prisoners being killed, their organs being used. You can argue about the ethics of that all one wants. And I know, say, Europeans who are very much against the death penalty find this really abhorrent. But the truth is, Charles, is that nobody's really losing sleep over that. I don't believe that's, people are worried about death row prisoners being misused after they're dead. I really don't believe that's the issue here. The reason why we're talking about this today is because there's the possibility of innocent people being killed. Yeah.
So you made reference to this expression that you used with me when you and I were talking, sort of preparing for the show last week, I guess it was, which is 1.0, organ harvesting 1.0. What do you mean by that exactly?
What I mean is if you think of this as a kind of a software arrangement, a way of doing business, it's just a convenient way to think about it, really. This was fairly primitive. So in the beginning, they are just they're just using prisoners that have been condemned to death. And in 92, we get some first sign, at least I do. I picked this up in my research. It was almost accidental. There was a doctor. He was, in fact, a Uyghur doctor, but he was a practicing physician. And he was at a medical conference, and I was able to pull him out of that conference and talk to him. And he described a situation in 1992 where he is, in a van, and he's at a execution ground up on a hill in southern China on a partly cloudy day, and there are about 20 vans waiting for prisoners to be shot. And these vans all have red crosses and so forth. They represent different hospitals and universities and so forth. And his job is to remove the kidneys and liver from this. I believe it's actually only the kidneys. This is in 92, and then he removes the kidneys from approximately 35-year-old Han Chinese male. And he knows that it's going to another Han Chinese male who's probably about 45 or so. The body is still twitching. It's been freshly shot, and there's still sort of slight death throes, but that's not the issue. The problem was that he noticed that there was a mark around the man's neck, a very angry bruise, very thin, and he knew what this meant. It meant that that prisoner had been silenced in court. What they would do was wrap a wire around the prisoner's neck to keep them from speaking. Now, that person, as he thought about it, he said, well, that person might have had Tourette's syndrome. He might have been a crazy man. You just don't know. But it also occurred to him that this man was being silenced because he was a political prisoner. And that was where he started to have doubts about what he was doing. started to feel like, well, maybe this wasn't really giving life. This wasn't a medical miracle. This was something possibly terrible was happening. But he didn't know. There was no way for him to identify who this man really was and what his history was. In 1994, you start to pick up something quite different. And now I'm sure your audience is somewhat familiar with Western China at this point, Northwest China, the area called Xinjiang, because there's been a lot of talk about it, yes? This is where the Uyghurs live. They tend to be Muslim, a bit Muslim light, but they tend to be Muslim, and they speak a completely different language than Chinese people do, and they're readily understood in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and countries like that. They're Central Asians, and in Xinjiang, that's what the Chinese call it. It means new territory. They call it East Turkestan. In Xinjiang in 1994, there was a young man who worked with the Public Security Bureau of China. In fact, he was the only Uyghur in this Public Security Bureau unit, yes, which was there to, that unit was specifically stationed in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, to crack down on Uyghur separatists. Yes, so this was where he found himself, and he was a Uyghur, but they liked him. The Chinese liked him. They thought he had a nice smile. He was funny. He was a very lively guy. And in 1994, and he claims he didn't exactly see this, but I believe he sort of removed himself from the story, one step removed, if you follow me. Basically, at one of these executions, screams are heard coming from the hospital vans. And he was told about this. This man's name is Nijat, and he was told about this. And he said what kind of screams were coming from the van. And his Chinese colleague told him, like from hell. In other words, it was the first sign of live organ harvesting. Now, what we don't know is if they started that in other places, but it is true that Xinjiang, in particular, has always been China's laboratory, its dirty laboratory. This is where they tested nuclear weapons back in the 60s, and the terrible fallout, terrible birth defects, and deaths from various cancers that are associated with that sort of radiation over the years. This has been a land where they do medical experiments, and this seems to fit the bill, that they were starting to do live organ harvesting. This is something no one in the world had really done at that time.
So I understand your implication, but just to be crystal clear, what's that mean, live organ harvesting, as opposed to
Okay.
what, and exactly what are we talking about? I mean, I know
Usually
this
when
is a
you think,
horrifying subject,
right.
but let's delve into it.
Well, usually you would wait till it's the dead donor rule. You wait till the person is dead, and then you remove their organs. They're still fairly fresh. You remove the organs, and you transplant any ones you can into a new person. For example, my cousin lives up here in Vermont, and he had to take a flight on a Learjet down from Vermont to New York City, and he was within, I think, 4 hours of the donor's death. He had a new lung. Okay, I believe it was 4 hours, maybe 5 or 6. But the point is, you can do that, and you can pull that off. The problem is that our bodies are predisposed to fight with any new organ, new tissue that comes into it. It's seen as an enemy, and so the system will try to defeat it. Now, apparently, and I'm not quite sure of the science behind this, I'm not a practicing physician, but if the body is still alive when the organ is extracted, it's quite different. The new body does not recognize it as an enemy necessarily, and it tends to be a much smoother transition. So it's a little bit like cutting flowers under running water. We don't know quite why that works, but it certainly works, right? Everybody's done it, and You buy some flowers at the store, you cut them under running water, and you put them into the vase, and then your flowers stay healthy for a long time. It's a little bit like that. Uh, Now, live organ harvesting was something people have talked about for many years and been very excited about, including Dr. Kevorkian, actually. He was fascinated with this whole idea. Uh, but China was really the first to really put this into practice on a wide scale. Yeah. So by 1995, we have a doctor whose name is Enver Tohti. And he is a youngish Uyghur surgeon. And his superior at the Urumqi hospital comes to him and says, Enver, do you want to do something fun tomorrow? And he says, yeah, okay. He says, get a surgical team together, be outside tomorrow at 8 in the morning, and we'll take it from there. So he does. He doesn't know what this is about, but he pulls his surgical team together. They end up driving out to the Western Mountain Execution Ground outside of Urumqi. This is where they commonly, one side of it at least, is where they commonly execute political prisoners. He's told to wait beside the hill, so he can't sort of see what's going on, but they say, when you hear the shots, come around. He does. He's driving. He's a little panicked. He sees a lot of dead bodies, maybe 20. Okay. There's a lot of shouting and commotion, and they direct him over, and they say, this is your body. This is it. This is the man. And he gets out of the car, and he says, this man is dead. What's there to do here? And then he realizes the man is not dead. There's a heartbeat. There's a pulse. And they say, that's right. He's not dead. Now get him, operate now, quickly. And they pull the guy onto a van. It's got a little working environment. And they say, take out the kidneys and the liver now. Do it fast, immediately. He gets into a little argument with his anesthesiologist, who sort of says, what's the point of giving this guy anesthesia? He's in shock. He's not going to resist. And so Enver, who is used to doing this, but has never done it in these kinds of conditions, finds himself trying to sketch the cut and so forth, and they're just like, no, do it now. And so he does. He cuts out the organs, and then because he realizes the family members may be nearby, he spends some time trying to stitch up the body to make it look normal. Now, when he makes that first cut, though, there is resistance. The body spasmodically lurched, if you like. Okay, there was a spasm, but the person was too weak. This man was too weak to resist the scalpel, and as Enver has subsequently admitted, this man could have lived. He was shot, but he was not shot in a lethal way. He was shot in the chest. He could have been repaired and gone on to live. Instead, his organs, these vital organs, are removed, and the man died. Now, Enver's not quite sure when he died, although he swears that the blood was pulsing the entire time, indicating that, in fact, the heart was still beating throughout the entire operation.
So something that just a couple of points here to hit on. I mean, you've made this clear in what you said so far, but just because I want the listeners to be clear on this. I mean, all of this work you have done on organ harvesting, this horrific subject, you've done a tremendous amount of what I would call field research. I mean, as you've detailed now in at least two anecdotes, you're talking directly to people who were involved in this kind of thing. Is that an accurate statement?
That is accurate, and it's the kind of research I prefer, though I don't dismiss people who do heavy statistical research and go through Chinese documents and that sort of thing. I have a lot of respect for those people. This is my emotional preference, is to try to get as close to the cold face using witnesses whenever possible.
Sure. Well, and the other thing that I think is also crystal clear from what you're saying, again, just for the benefit of listeners who are coming into this subject cold, if you will, and sort of trying to catch up with the horror. This is not what you're talking about here. Is not something where we've got a a handful of guys in a back alley somewhere in some Chinese city. This is being done by Chinese, well, at the direction of Chinese officials at official execution grounds and other locations. In other words, I guess what I'm getting at is that there's no question here that this is the Chinese government directing this and engaging in this.
That's correct, Charles. It's also true that, I mean, I don't doubt that there's the occasional back alley harvesting that's going on in China, the kind of kidney in the bathtub story stuff taking place from time to time. That's the kidney in the bathtub story is actually somewhat real. I mean, there have been incidents like that all over the world, especially in poorer countries. But no, in this case, look, China is a surveillance state. Even back in the 1990s, when this is happening in 1995, organ harvesting 1.0, it's a surveillance state. You can't enter an execution ground without authorization, and so forth. Right? This is not some sort of rogue doctor's operation. That's an argument that the Chinese Communist Party dances out once a year to sort of try to explain this stuff. It never goes anywhere. And in fact, I'm not saying there aren't cases of this in other countries. It's been documented in Egypt, certainly some other places. But the truth is that's minor compared to the scale we're talking about here. And that's because this is state authorized.
So at this stage that we're talking about, again, for the benefit of the listeners, we're in the first of what will be three separate segments focusing on this issue. Where we are right now chronologically, if you will. What's the motivation for the Chinese Communist Party, for the Chinese government? I mean, beyond what's driving them to do this? You're now describing a situation where they're, I would say, murdering people to tear out their organs. Why?
It's a great question, and we don't have fantastic answers on that. It's not, I don't like to make Nazi comparisons, but let's make one just to sort of tease this out a little. The Nazis tended to make things very ideologically clear. They made a rational anti-Semitism, if you like, that justified the final solution. They put the final solution into documents and so forth. Now, the Chinese may have done that too, but we're not in the middle of a war and we haven't discovered those documents. So we don't fully know what the thinking was at the Central Committee level. What we do know through the medical journals and so forth, and this is where I think a lot of my colleagues' research comes into play, was there was a real fascination with this. They saw this as a breakthrough opportunity, and maybe the part of Chinese medical, the way the Chinese medical world thinks about itself, its image is that, they dare to do what others will not, right? This is something I ran into many years ago when I had a problem with a brain tumor, and I went into libraries and read a lot about my brain tumor. This is the days before the real internet. And, I was struck by the Chinese experiments. I mean, they were willing to try practically anything when it came to the gamma knife and various radiation treatments and so forth, often with disastrous results. I think that's part of the culture here. Okay. At the same time, you have people in this case, and we don't know about 95. I mean, Enver Tohti, that doctor, does not know if the person he killed was actually a political prisoner. He doesn't know if he was a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Christian or an atheist. He does not know. He suspects that this person was probably a political prisoner, in part for one reason. The guy's head was not shaved. Everybody else was. That's a small little clue, but it suggests that this man might have been a political prisoner. We don't know, but we do know that this becomes clearer over time. By 1996, that same fellow I mentioned, Nijat, the guard, is explicitly told by the prisoner, by the chief surgeon at his outpost that they are doing live organ harvesting. So he's told that. It's explicit. In 1997, we have what's called the Ghoul Joy Incident. That was a city named Gulja. It's a rather large city filled with Uyghurs and Kazakhs and so forth. And the Chinese were cracking down on the celebration of Ramadan. Saying you can't celebrate Ramadan anymore. And they went out in the middle of the winter and had a little demonstration in front of the town hall. That demonstration was met with, they were unarmed. That demonstration was met with force. The Chinese estimates were that about 40 people were killed. The Uyghur estimates are about 400. I'm not sure what to make of that exactly. That's not my field, but I do know, and I've talked to a policeman who was a Uyghur policeman at the time, that this was followed by organ harvesting. Okay, that people who were killed were actually harvested for their organs. And we know for sure, too, as well, that the bodies were buried under guard. That is, the families can no longer examine the bodies in any way, right? So that's in 1997, we have the first case. Then we have an even more explicit case. And this one, I cannot use the fellow's name, but he was a young doctor, again, in Urumqi, in the capital. And he was told by his superior to go to the Urumqi prison, the political prisoner wing, and take blood samples of the political prisoners. And he asked why. And his superior said, there are 6 high-ranking cadres who've arrived. They're staying at the such-and-such hotel. They're waiting for kidneys. Okay, but all you have to do is go in and take blood samples. In other words, we just need to map out the blood types there. You don't have to go any further. And so he did. He went off to do this, and it's interesting. There was a panic among the political prisoners, and they sort of said, you're a Uyghur like us. How can you do this to us? And they were screaming and yelling at him, and he kept saying, look, this is just for your health. I'm just taking blood to just check out your health. The 6 cadres got their organs, and they left. And then a couple of months later, another 6 cadres arrived. Same hotel.
So we're closing in on probably the end of this segment, but I have to say, my reaction to that story is we're now shifting into the not just butchering of people that are executed, but basically executing people to order. Is that where we are?
I think we are. I think that's very astute, and that's exactly where this was leading. At the same time, though, we're talking about a fairly small-scale operation. What's interesting about it is that it's done on behalf of Chinese Communist Party. This is not some wealthy people. It's not even wealthy organ tourists from overseas. It's just for the Chinese Communist Party, who, as you know, is very old and often has a lot of them today have a lot of lung problems because China is very polluted and so forth. So that's where and what's interesting about it was this fellow, whose name I can't mention, talked with me for quite a while about what he thought about this. And he said, well, I didn't know. I knew that they were bad people. That's what I was told, that these political prisoners were bad people, that we shouldn't feel guilty about this. And he kind of rationalized it by saying, well, I thought maybe this was just a response to the Ghoul Joy incident, right? A response to this little uprising. And these were sort of spoils seized in the fog of war, if you like, right? That this wasn't something that would go on, that this was just a temporary thing, a kind of a bloodletting, a retribution of sorts, right? And that was his assumption. That's the way he chose to think about it at that time. Of course, when I interviewed him, it was much later. It was around 2011. And by then he realized that he was one of the people at the cusp of this thing, right? Now, we don't know how widespread that was. Perhaps that was happening in several cities. Again, many of the signals we get on this they're fragments, right? It's as if we're seeing a star. that's very, very old. It's out in the sky. We don't know. We don't even know if that star exists anymore. To some extent, we're getting these sort of weak radio signals from China. But we have to do the best we can in pulling together a narrative from that. And that's what I've attempted to do. And that is what, if you look at it in those terms, you can see how this is organ harvesting 1.0. It's a software program, if you like, that doesn't have to go anywhere. Maybe it's just a temporary program. It's just a trial, right? And that is, in many ways, China's fate would be very different if it had ended there.
So, Ethan, I think as you and I discussed when we were getting ready for this last week off the air, I think that's a perfect place to sort of end this segment, because obviously the next segment is, as you've already strongly suggested, the shifting into something that's even more horrifying and much bigger. Thank you very much for being with us. I look forward to talking to you next time.
Thanks, Charles.
And thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time on Ground Truth.